Hi, I'm Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer at HiddenLayer. Today we're going to talk about financial services playbook that we just released on securing AI. And with me today, I have Gary and Juan. Thank you guys both for joining. But before we jump into it, Gary, why don't you do a little bit of an intro?
Yeah, just a quick background on me, and thanks for having me here today, Malcolm. I appreciate the invite. My background, easy. I spent 25 years in the Air Force working in the information technology and cybersecurity space. When I came out, I spent a short amount of time in the consulting space with Deloitte, security and privacy. And then I moved to USAA, a financial services company, where I spent 12 years as their chief security officer, had a wide portfolio of responsibilities. I retired from USA a few years ago, did a break in between doing some consulting, and then I ended back up at AIG, a large commercial insurance company, where I just left them about a month ago. So have been doing a lot of different things over the years.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks, Gary. Juan.
Sure. Malcolm, thank you first of all, and glad to actually share the forum with Gary and you, and excited to actually honestly be here with you guys. As far as I'm concerned, I've been doing cyber for about 30 years now. It's all I've done, and I think it's all I'm ever going to do because it's such an exciting and ever changing field. But in terms of my career, a progressive career, I've actually led security organizations both on the build up and on the maintain as well. Large enterprises is what I've actually been working on for the last many years, right? Inclusive of Delta Airlines, Check Free Corporation, Lennar Corporation, Whirlpool, and just as recently as to a couple months ago, I joined a Berkshire Hathaway portfolio company called McLane, focusing extremely on supply chain and logistics, right? And again, my kind of what I bring to the table is the ability to actually go and embrace cyber resilience, especially at the speed of business, right? And trying to actually make sure that those organizations understand how to manage that risk and how to sustain impact, right? And not only just through the evolution of technology, but also through the pivot points that are presented through these inflections that are, that disruptive technologies bring to the table, such as AI.
Awesome, awesome. Hey, so let's dive into this a little bit. Again, we released this playbook, here recently, and it's got some really cool parts to it. And we won't dive totally into it, but we'll talk around some of the stuff. The four primary parts of the guide are, knowing your AI environment, governing it, strengthening your AI systems, but also staying ahead with audits and continuous oversight. But for me, like with any technology, but specifically with AI, risk always comes from the benefits derived from the use of something, right? So if it's high benefit, if it's compromised in some way, it's obviously high risk. You know, when you look at AI broadly and more specifically in the financial sector, Gary, why don't you comment on some of the use cases, right, that you've seen over the years and you might see going forward here over the next couple of years, particularly with the evolution of AI into agentic AI. What do you think are the primary value drivers for AI in the financial services industry? You gotta there you go,
Yeah,
Gary.
sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, I came out of the financial services banking industry. And my portfolio actually started off for many years. I had fraud, and I even had for a short amount of time anti-money laundering as part of the portfolio. And so, you're looking at an area space that is ripe for the use of AI, even in its earliest forms like machine learning, that can analyze large existing data sets and look for patterns of suspicious transactions, et cetera. So I think the financial sector is ripe for, continuing to evolve the use of AI. They deal with large amounts of information, very complex data sets. They need to come up with things like credit scoring decisions, look for certain types of transactions. So they're well postured just from the perspective of the type of data that they deal with and the type of decisions that they have to make. I think when you look at machine learning as just kind of the starting point, and you start moving it to generative AI and then agentic AI, it's a perfect evolution, right? You get more autonomous as you move along. The generative AI has really been starting to see the usefulness, particularly in making better decisions, right? In complex transactions like underwriting, for example, in insurance.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And again, I think you mentioned it in terms of the risk assessments and the fraud side. That's how the bank manages risk, right? So using AI as a risk management tool in many ways to mitigate fraud issues and to make better decisions. And then even, on the customer support side, chatbots and potentially, algorithmic trading or other things that could guide, banking customers or investment customers in making better decisions, rather than having to talk to a broker or, somebody that's a financial advisor and move that stuff into,
Yeah.
perhaps some type of, generative AI solution or agentic solution.
Yeah, Malcolm, let me add additional color. Let me just say that, right? So as we think about risk and how um, highly regulated industries actually manage risk, I think that part of that equation is also compliance, right? And how do we actually go in and manage that compliance risk that often drives highly regulated industries like the financial service? And I think that there are some pretty interesting use cases to actually go and better create awareness and, let's just say, understand the lay of the land in terms of that compliance perspective, right? And so I do expect AI heavily to influence our ability to actually go and comply better to regulations in the future, especially in those highly regulated industries and organizations. So no, I think there's plenty. I mean, you can talk about fraud detection, risk assessments, customer service, and all those things. But when I think of cybersecurity and cyber resilience, as we actually call it today, in the financial services industry, I think a lot of what moves the needle is compliance, right? Just and that I think is going to become a lot easier to actually measure and kind of orchestrate to be able to actually go and give better outcomes using AI, specifically agentic AI, right? I mean, not only as I, as an organization, need to actually be compliant, but how do I actually ensure that my supply chain is also compliant, right? The people that I rely on, all the things that we got to do. And we've seen things such as how do I, for example, ensure that a response to a addendum, a security addendum to an MSA is actually kind of being responded the right way, right? And
No, I think you're exactly right. It's also how does the financial services industry adopt AI solutions
hmm,
that allow them to enhance their security, enhance their compliance, let alone the other, business value propositions in a bank. I was having a dialogue just a couple of weeks ago. And I think we've all potentially gotten used to, taking a picture of a physical check or things like that. And even in the banking industry, using images as a form of moving money and saying, yes, that's a deposit, and then AI in the background, you're reading and analyzing that picture of a check or a deposit and stuff like that. Again, even that use of AI in terms of image analysis, depending upon the bank and what they're offering in terms of solutions to the customers with mobile banking and stuff like that, there's a whole litany of things that can improve the customer experience and facilitate, faster transactions than having to go to the ATM machine to deposit a check.
mhm,
Yeah, the other thing that Juan made me think of, Malcolm, was just on the other side, that the front end of this, as new regulations coming out, you have to keep track of all of these things. You have to figure out how does it impact us, and how do we ensure we're compliant. So I just think back recently when DORA first came out from an international side, we're trying to figure out, having to go through, analyze it line by line and figure it out. That's where AI can really, really help from a speed perspective and just from an accuracy perspective.
mhm,
Yeah. Well, yeah, let alone even other report writing techniques, right? That, again, banks, like everything else, they have to write, in essence, conduct audits, write things for regulators, and again, using AI solutions even in that context to again facilitate what would have been a manual task of just opening up a Word document or something and starting to do the analysis and the writing itself versus saying, hey, we've got all this evidence of the bank meeting its liquidity requirements and other things that a regulator would look for bank solvency, and then using that to aid even in that compliance could be valuable for a bank.
Yep.
Well, and, that also then gets into, okay, given all those use cases, the potential, subversion of the AI that could occur, an evasion attack, poisoning, prompt injection, stuff like that. So I've always believed, and I think you guys, have kind of agreed that, if you have a benefit of something, that benefit, if compromised, is actually your impact, right? It's the blast radius of what could occur if something was to go wrong. If in that fraud sense, Gary, if I was able to manipulate or understand the weights of a model and infer certain things, and in essence navigate past the AI fraud detection, I could conduct, banking fraud and perceptually get away with it for at least a period of time, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean that, and ultimately the bottom line is bottom line impact, right? Real fraud losses. And one thing that's interesting, particularly in the early days, fraud teams are always tweaking their models, right? They're tweaking it based on a lot of different inputs, geographical inputs, trend inputs, market inputs. They're constantly trying to tweak it by hand. And the bad guys understand that, right? They understand how that works. And so that's sort of at the outer end. But if they could get to the inner side of this problem, right, where the model is actually itself compromised, right, that has a huge implication just in terms of, you know, impact, the risk part of it as well as the data quality of it.
Yep, yep. Hey, so Juan, go back to the customer service angle of use of AI in customer service in the financial services industry. And again, I'm a banking customer. I'm logging into my bank. Let's say there's a chat bot. I'm interacting with it, and again, there's the ability to do a prompt injection. Obviously, big concern could be, potential data breach or identity theft or a wide variety of things. What do you think there in terms of that customer service use and the attacks that could again cause either impact to a customer or material impact to the bank itself?
So I, I think I'm going to give you somewhat of a generic answer to this, right? Because us security professionals are always thriving into the quantifying and qualifying impact, risk, and all those type of things, right? I mean, that's and the truth is, in right now in this mode, it's hard to quantify what the potential impact and how this is. What I would actually argue is that as we actually deploy as organizations and security professionals deploy new capabilities, whether it's a chatbot that it's AI enabled or not, making the assumption that the bad guys are not actually out there and testing it every single second as to what, how I can actually trick the system to be able to actually do things that they're not intended to. It's the failure, right? The failure is assuming that there is not that we just didn't open a significant vector of attack into our environment is the number one flaw that I think is actually creating issues today, right? And that approach is just not. So thinking that it's bulletproof, even if you've done your own homework and put guardrails within those systems, that uh, the old adage, right, as to we got to be right every single time versus the bad guys got to be right once, it still holds true on this one, right? The concern here is that I do sense that the industry is not necessarily paying enough attention to the fact that it is a threat vector, that it is something that we have to pay attention. There's not a lot of organizations that are pen testing their AI models and their LLMs and things to that effect. And I think that worries me to the point. So, and again, when I think of AI in a very generic way, most people would like to actually think of, there is cyber for AI and there is AI for cyber, right? If we're blocking this conversation into the first part, which is, how do we inject security into the way we actually are using AI, the way that it is actually affecting our businesses, the way that it's actually transforming the way we do things, we have to actually pay attention to all the things that we know and the things that we don't know, right? I mean, the unknowns are what actually worries me the most, to be honest with you, as we move forward.
Now that makes
So
sense. It makes sense. And Gary, I'll let you comment here in a second. But you bring up a good point, and then but in the financial services industry, if you look at the security spend, right, in aggregate of the couple $1 trillion we spend on IT, we spend what 270 billion on infosec.
Mhm.
As an aggregate, the financial services industry typically spends a higher percentage of their
Right,
IT budget on security.
right.
You know, but is that security spend sufficient and does it adequately protect the models themselves from attack? I don't, Gary, why don't you
yeah.
make your comment and then we'll go back and answer that question.
Well, I was going to kind of comment to that without even knowing what you were going to say, and
Perfect.
basically is, I think that we're still early on in this AI evolution, right? And I think that there's a misconception, and I've had to work through it myself early on, is you can drop these AI models and these AI applications into a traditional security environment, and your existing security environment is going to
Mhm.
protect the models, right? And that's not true, right? I mean, the traditional security model is pretty much based on infrastructure, protecting infrastructure. You've got your network and infrastructure security, IAM, data protection, encryption, all the traditional things, and that's all good. That's all important, and you need it. I would probably say that it's necessary but not sufficient because I think there is a gap here in the traditional security model. I think one model level vulnerabilities don't go they go undetected, right? So you're essentially blind in that scenario. So a lot of these things, these input adversarial inputs that are trying to trick model outputs, right? Prompt injection attacks. Every prompt injection attack that works is essentially a 0-day. You didn't know about it, or it would have been fixed in advance, right? So it's a different type of model, and so the traditional, prevent, detect, respond model, the prevention side of it is not near as robust as it will ever need to be in that space. So you have to be much better at detecting and responding to it. So
Mhm.
I don't think that and the other thing I would say is much of what the financial services spends their budget on is compliance oriented, right? And that's not bad. It's not sufficient, right, by itself.
Mhm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, well, that brings up another interesting question, on the compliance side. Obviously, for certainly since generative AI has come out, but even in the traditional ML sense, in terms of how AI was used, the financial services industry obviously has regulatory requirements of fairness and non-bias and non-discriminatory and all that stuff. And that kind of walks us into that ethical, responsible AI world, which again is good. It's necessary, but that those aspects of fairness and non-bias and the transparency and all that type of stuff. What what's missed in that, I could look at it and go, well, if that's dominating it, shouldn't that then protect me from these attack vectors? I don't know. Juan, what do you think?
Now, I've always had this concern, right? Because over the last couple of years, we've seen, a bunch of publications which are well intended. Don't take me the wrong way in terms of the ethical use of AI, right? From a defensive perspective, I cannot assume that everybody's going to be ethical in using AI, right? So to me, it's a non-starter, right? I have to assume unethical, right? As I'm protecting my organization, and I think, but it's also not only in the delivery, but it's also in how we actually position AI capabilities for the enterprise, right? This concept of, for example, rogue AI is happening left and right, right? I mean, we get bombarded with new capabilities, new agents, and if you think that your employees are not being wowed by any of the last 10, capabilities on the AI side, whether it's video, and Google just came out with fantastic ways of doing that. I mean, they're all playing with it. They may not be doing it in your computer, they may not be doing it during office hours, but they're actually going back home and playing with it, right?
Yeah, well, and they might be bringing that stuff then back into work, right? Directly or indirectly.
Absolutely. They might work at their home system and then email the answer over to their work system and repurpose it. That's how that's been working.
Yeah, well, and I think, there's some other challenges, obviously, that can occur, as we expand this out with RAG architectures and the model content protocol MCP, as just we try and ingest even from the things that we've got within our environment and start bringing in other information and other links into the AI solutions, because that just there's other ways of in essence hooking those things up and indirectly injecting into models that again introduces risk, let alone that I do it at home and I bring it back into work that might create a different set of exposures. What do you guys think
Yeah,
of?
I think you've got
Go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say what you just described is this AI sprawl challenge, right? Which is it's everywhere, it's interconnected, it becomes more interdependent, right? And trying to understand that environment because going back to your ethics conversation, right? From a compliance perspective, you have to know what you have and how it's being used. You have to trust but verify in order to be able to intelligently, validate what you've got. And so in this sprawling environment where you're constantly adding and connecting and linking and bolting things on and ingesting more data, it just becomes a huge challenge, right? That you almost can't get your arms around.
Yeah, well, I've always had this view over the years because I've had been around AI, even back in my Intel days when I was CISO, I ran enterprise capabilities, and the early nascent data science team was in that enterprise capabilities team. So I've been around some aspects of the evolution of ML into this stuff, for almost 20 years. But I've always, looked at it, it's like it's and I've come to the conclusion it's not responsible if it's not secure. Because, I mean, let's just look at it and be real brass tacks. Let's say you've got, AI in the fraud side of things and in the loan processing side and all that stuff, and you've done all the ethical, fairness, responsible stuff. I would venture to say there's probably a white supremacist out there who doesn't want a particular ethnic group to buy a house in a particular neighborhood. Well, if they can subvert the model, via one of these attack vectors, they will, right? And so the only way to provide assurance of the responsible and ethical stuff is, in essence, the security around the model. Do you guys agree with that?
I do.
Yeah, and I would add for those that have been in financial services, you're going to be intimately familiar with Supervision and Regulatory Letter 11-7, which talks about model risk management and making sure that your models are validated against unexpected outcomes or inappropriate outcomes, right? Or those that could have a huge impact, material impact to the company. And so there's a lot of compliance work that goes into model risk management to address just exactly those kind of scenarios. I think it's a lot harder now in the AI space because the models before were much more static type of models. You can validate inputs and outputs pretty, straightforward. I think your generative AI LLM world is much more complicated.
Yeah, yeah, because yeah, those other ones were way more deterministic, right? If they went out
Exactly.
of bounds, you'd pretty quickly know. But in this, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly learning, and depending upon how you tease it with the prompt, you could do stuff. And this also, I think I had sent you guys both, back several weeks ago. We had announced a universal bypass across all
Mhm.
LLMs and all their guardrails, right? It was policy puppetry and the ability to, in essence, change the policy sets and in essence bypass all the guardrails. That in and of itself. is a clear indication that you can't just rely on, the existing guardrails, the policy settings, or just doing your upfront, responsible stuff, or even just your security development lifecycle and saying, okay, it was good, but now it's in production. Well, attacks happen when they're in production, right?
Which is a very good point, right? Um, the the speed in which organizations have actually picked up AI capabilities is unprecedented, right? Even highly regulated organizations and industries, right? I mean, I'm thinking historical, right? I mean, you wouldn't take financial industry to actually be the ones that first went to cloud computing, for example, right? I mean, they
Right.
took time. They wanted to make sure that, everything was stick and tight and everything was perfect. Not perfect, but you get the point. Versus AI, just because of the value proposition associated with that, everybody's running towards it, right? And I almost want to tell people pause a little bit, things that you need to do to be able to actually make sure that you end up in those situations. You don't end up in those situations in which you just have a big problem, and find yourself into data disclosure, or even worse, manipulating the models to nefarious, mean ends, right? So that's kind of where I worried about. And the sprawl, as Gary mentioned, is a bit out of control. And as much as I'd like to put guardrails within my organization, and I do, you know, nothing stops from actually people doing the other stuff that it's by definition rogue IT and rogue data, rogue governance, rogue everything, and that's kind of where I think I'm worried. And it actually almost requires an entire different skill set, which is also another worrying perspective, right? How many cybersecurity professionals that are also well versed in AI do we have that are at our disposal? That's a so this is kind of where I think, and I know it's not talking specifically about HiddenLayer, because this is about the problem, not really the solution, but companies need to actually take on that ability to be able to actually empower current and future cyber workforce to be able to actually better understand the problem and solve the problem. We're not there, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Well, and this, gets back to, the structure of the guide that we put out, and a lot of the things we've talked about. You could almost argue it's a little bit of a back to basics, right? You got to know your AI environment. Well, no different than we've got to know our IT environment, right? We've got to govern our AI systems. No different than IT governance. It's just how do I apply that in the AI world, right? You get to strengthen your AI systems, right? By doing some of the things that, we've talked about, some of the stuff that's in the guide in terms of, that security development lifecycle, the model integrity, the model scanning, the runtime protection. Juan, you mentioned, penetration testing, that red teaming, and those type of things. And that's, where you're going to have to do all of those things to stay, ahead of things, and then just have that kind of continuous oversight and continuous monitoring of the AI systems, right?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hey,
I liked how you said that, Malcolm. It when you look at that, when you look at the framework of the playbook, it's essentially a higher level version of NIST cybersecurity framework, or in any of these
yep.
critical controls, right? The top critical controls. I mean, it's just a subset version of that. And I like how it starts off with know your environment. The whole asset management, asset inventory problem is always a hill that you never get to the top of, right? And then you start adding, from the traditional hardware software environment, you add OT and IoT in there. Now you're adding AI models in there. Then we added APIs in before that. I mean, it was, the environment, continually grows in terms of what you have to know.
Yeah, well, and even, as we get into, again, agents of agents, right? You start having this architecture of your AI systems, and understanding all that connective tissue, and how it can affect business processes, affect your customers, affect the business, is a part of knowing that environment, governing it, strengthening around, your exposures, and then staying ahead of it, with things. Hey, well, why don't you guys give me your kind of final thoughts around, again, yeah, a little bit of the guide, but also, more in particular, what you think about in terms of AI in the financial services industry, and hopefully, what would you tell somebody who's struggling with this? What should they go do, here between now and the end of the year?
Yeah, I'll start it off and kick it over to Juan. Juan, listen, I think we're still early on, but it's moving fast. So I think the difference between this and other innovations is the speed that this thing is moving and becoming operationalized within the environment, right? And I think myth number one is traditional security is good enough, right, for this environment, which it's not. And when I think about the guide, I think it's like it's basic, but it's straightforward, right? This is something I struggle with as well, which is knowing your environment. Like, what is my inventory of AI, right? And be able to categorize it because we use the term AI. AI is a catch-all, right? There's machine learning, there's generative AI, agentic AI, right? And so, it's not all the same from a risk implications perspective. And so, having the ability to understand that environment, making sure that it's up to date. I mean, I think just that's the starting point, right? Knowing what you've got. I think the other thing that I would say based on experience is this is not a CISO only problem. It
Mm.
may feel like it, and sometimes it'll just get thrown over the fence. But my experience has been you have a lot of stakeholders. They may not want to be involved, but there's a lot of stakeholders, legal and compliance and privacy, enterprise risk. These are all key partners along with IT and security, right? So you can't own the entirety of this problem, but there's some pieces that you are responsible for, like knowing the environment. I think that's right up your alley. And so how all that links together from an effective governance model, right? If you try to pull this together yourself, I think it's going to be really hard in a large organization. But looking for those stakeholders and starting with the basics, right? Knowing your environment. I think that's what I would tell people to focus on.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. Juan.
Gary, more of the same a little bit. I would say that the only thing that I would add to what Gary said is, as we think about, how do we position cybersecurity and more importantly, cyber resilience as part of our strategy, just the forefront of our strategy as heavier reliance on technology happens, especially in the financial services industry. Part of that process is to understand as we look at threat surface management, you need to consider AI as a vector of attack, right? And unfortunately, I see a lot of that lack of perspective, right? And not necessarily focus on the financial services industry, but just in general, right? If it's a vector of attack, then the basics, you got to start with basics, just like you said, hygiene on the environment, get your inventory, understand what are the risks associated with going outside of the guardrails and creating that governance model that associates, and then build capabilities, right? I mean, just like we've done in the past for every single thing that we've encountered as pivots into the cyber resilience world, right? Whether it was cloud or anything like that, understand what you have, build a capability internally, start building processes and relying on technologies that can actually better pen test that capability so that you can even actually do purple team exercises against your AI models, right? I mean, did you see it, not see it? Was it effective? Was it controlled? Was the guardrail enabled, not enabled? Can I trick it to actually go and do other things? Those are the type of things we're not thinking in that way just yet, right? And I think that's where I think that the focus needs to be.
Awesome. Thanks, Juan. Thanks, Gary. And for everybody who's watching this, again, I think we've covered it, and I think you need to know your AI environment, govern your AI systems, strengthen your AI systems, and stay ahead with audits and oversight. You can find more information by downloading our financial services guide to securing AI at hiddenlayer.com. You can also sign up for staying on top of the latest research of where we're finding 0 days and systemic risk issues in models and model architectures at hiddenlayer.com. Again, thank you for watching. If there's things that HiddenLayer can help with, please reach out. And again, Gary, Juan, thank you for your perspectives and your time today.
Of course, Malcolm.